Hey guys, Mike's here. We've got another great episode for you today. I'm joined by Dr. Ivan Kalmar to talk about right-wing populism and illiberal movements with a focus on Central Europe. Dr. Kalmar is a social anthropologist at the University of Toronto, and he's also the author of this amazing book, White But Not Quite. I'm on chapter 3 right now, and I've already learned so much. I can't wait to see what the rest of the book has in store. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and see you on the other side. So, I'd love to start at the beginning. What do you remember about growing up in 1950s Czechoslovakia?
Well, what I remember is, not that much. I mean, I was little, but one thing that came to my mind recently was when I heard that Donald Trump is shutting down the Voice of America. And when I was little in Czechoslovakia under communism, people listened to Radio Free Europe, which also is American funded, and they're taking the funding away, I believe. And we had this old-fashioned radio with like a green light that indicates whether it's tuned right, and I learned when I was about 5 to find out where Radio Free Europe was on the dial, and it was heavily jammed. So you could barely hear anything. You really had to strain to hear something in between those beeps and buzzes that they put on. And one day my parents were in the living room, and I decided to put on a little performance. And I I sort of performed Radio Free Europe. And I started with like, brr, 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 with all the buzzing and jamming and a little bit of the text. So my parents got really scared. My father jumped up and closed the window so someone on the street won't hear that I'm doing that. So I became very early aware of the sort of unfreedom that we were living under. And it created a conflict in me even as a child, because at school they were feeding us propaganda, which was getting milder and milder as I was growing up, to be fair. But there was like a dissonance between what not only we listened to, but we're supposed to repeat at school, and what I thought perhaps everyone else were actually thinking.
Yeah, I remember your tweet about the radio thing a few days ago. You tweeted about this.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. I mean, as an immigrant myself, and I know like you're technically speaking an immigrant, I'm always fascinated by how language affects identity, and so I just want to ask you, how has your relationship with your first language evolved over the course of your life? And I guess my end goal with this question would be to tap into the role of language in this East-West divide that we're going to talk about, especially given the global dominance of English.
Well, Mike, so I actually grew up with 2 languages because my father was from Slovakia and my mother from Hungary. So they're pretty different languages. And I lived in a town that was on the border with Hungary and was bilingual. And there was a campaign by the government to decrease people's identification with the Hungarian language. And one day, a teacher came to class and asked us all to state what our nationality was. And that doesn't mean citizenship, that means sort of ethnic identity. And the teacher said, kids, you can put down anything. Like, you don't have to be what your parents told you that you were, hoping perhaps that some Hungarian kids would say that they are Slovak. But I thought this was really interesting, so I put down English. that my nationality was English. And indeed, I always did have a real attachment to the English language already when I was a child. Okay, so, yeah, now in terms of the international domination of English, you couldn't really call it domination in communist Czechoslovakia. It was more like those who were attracted away from, they tried to make us speak Russian, to learn Russian anyway. It was an obligatory subject. But truly no one was interested in it, and it was often taught by a guy who was also teaching gym. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, but what I mean is that there was no passion really in it, and the teachers were not good. Many of the older people, including my parents, knew at least some German. And so to know English was a little bit more of a modern kind of attitude of identity with the West. And many people did try to learn English already at that time.
Interesting.
So when we left, my brother and I only speak English with each other, but I spoke Hungarian with my mother and Slovak with my father.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, so did any of your parents speak English?
Yeah, they learned English, but only mainly after we left Czechoslovakia, which was a long time ago. And they never learned it perfectly. I mean, I have an accent, but for the most part, I imagine that my vocabulary and sentence structure is correct. But my parents were like, they never got rid of all kinds of oddities.
Yeah,
My mother would say, as soon someone came, as opposed to as soon as.
yeah.
That sort of thing.
Interesting. Okay, let's talk about this amazing book. And I have tons of questions, but before we start with the questions, can you give us a high-level overview of what you're trying to say with this book?
Well, I guess I'm trying to say a number of things, so let me try to think about what might be the most important. Perhaps that people often think of Eastern Europe as a undifferentiated bloc, and that it has a tendency towards what I call illiberalism. That not everyone's familiar with the term, but it's sort of like right-wing nationalism, kind of reactionary, anti-liberal, or maybe just not liberal ways of thinking. Also racism, anti-Semitism, all of these things we associate with the far right, basically. And people, at the time I wrote the book, which was not long ago, it came out in 2022, the opinion was very common that this was true of Eastern Europe, which I don't agree with, and that it was due to A, Eastern European culture, and or B, the fact that democracy doesn't have deep roots in Eastern Europe. And I don't agree with any of these things. I don't agree that it's due to that it exists, particularly Eastern European illiberalism. I don't agree that it's rooted in Eastern European culture, and I don't agree that the roots of democracy in Eastern Europe are necessarily shallower than in much of Western Europe. Okay, so I wrote this book to make the point that I think that it's instead the case that if some of Eastern Europe, and not all, is disproportionately illiberal, it's because something in their condition resembles the condition of those people in the West who support illiberalism in the West. And I feel vindicated now that we see that Donald Trump, almost to those of us who know about, for example, the Hungarian illiberalism of Viktor Orban, it's almost like Donald Trump is copying Viktor Orban. When I wrote the book, it was said that by so many very smart people that, no, this could never happen in America. Because Eastern Europe has shallow roots in democracy, but America has deep roots in democracy. But now we see that it's happening in America. At least that's how I see it. So I try in the book to investigate the relationship between the West and the East in Europe after communism fell. Because I use that to explain the fact that illiberalism is attractive to people in Eastern Europe as it is elsewhere. And to put that in a nutshell, it's because Eastern Europe is a peripheral area of the Western system. It's what the part of Eastern Europe, it's more Central Europe I'm talking about. They're members of the European Union. I am not talking about Russia or Belarus. I'm talking about Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. And these are peripheral regions of the European Union. And I and other people find that people who are peripheral to the core of the Western capitalist system are often disproportionately attracted to illiberal ideas. And that might be people in the red states of the US, those who don't live in the most prestigious coastal areas. That might be people in the more southern peripheries of Europe, like Greece.
Yeah.
So I try to paint a kind of global picture here that gets away from ghettoizing Eastern Europe as a radically different area.
I see. And yeah, so in my mind, I'm like, there's so many different directions we can go from now. Like you brought up Viktor Orban, and I remember your tweet from a few days ago that you were reposting this article from New York Times, and it was like the way that we try to study politics in America is very America-centric. And you mentioned below that to really understand Trump, we have inevitably we have to understand Viktor Orban. And I think I will talk about that later. But so I guess my first follow-up question would be this idea of Central Europeanism that you mentioned. How is it different from any of these ideas that have been around, like Orientalism, anti-Slavism, German expansionism, and Russophobia, and Balkanism?
So I think you mean, I call it Eastern Europeanism.
Yeah.
Meaning what I would call, controversially probably, racism against Eastern Europeans. So if I could repeat your question so I understand right. How is it different from other racisms, or if we prefer just prejudices, such as Orientalism, which mainly would be against Arabs and Muslims in the tradition of that term, or Balkanism is a prejudice identified against people from the Balkans. And so there are many respected scholars, and I agree with them, that in the long-term history of what I would call racism in this case, I mean, some people might say ethnic prejudice or something like that, what I call racism in the long history of it, there is a kind of larger East that is deprecated in the West, and that's one of the meanings of the term Orientalism. And so because these places, the Balkans, is sort of in the east and south, so in the direction of the former Ottoman Empire, in the direction, which was a Muslim power. So the Balkanism is impregnated with Islamophobia. And then the anti-Slavism and Russophobia, that's something related, but in my opinion, different. Although people would rightly say that that also has much to do with Orientalism, because the tradition of depicting the Muslim in Europe, to make a long story short, is not only, looking down on Islam, because it was recognized that Islam was an alternative civilization. Okay, and until the 18th century, the Muslim powers were stronger, arguably, than the Western powers. Okay, and many people, even in the 19th century, 20th century, many intellectuals, for example, converted to Islam, especially Sufi. But when it comes to Russia, it's more like the barbarians than the Muslim powers. And the Germans German anti-Russians, Russophobes, would refer to Russia as half Asiatic. They meant a kind of backward, wild Tatars would be the sort of prototype who are dangerous. They want to invade Europe and destroy it. So it's related. Maybe it's a version of Orientalism. The anti-Eastern Europeanism that I'm talking about, in my opinion, is a modern phenomenon that overlaps with these old ones. And a lot of scholars would disagree with me on this, but this is how I see it. I think it started mostly after 1989, and the foundations for it were laid in 1945 with the Cold War. Why do I think this? Because anti-Slavism, for example, never concerned Romanians or Hungarians, especially not Hungarians, who had a different image from the Slavs in the 19th century. And they aren't Slavs, but also they had a different image. So the idea and the Balkanism also never affected Czechs or Lithuanians. So I'd like to recall for those who are watching that I'm not talking about Russia and Belarus, but I'm talking about the eastern parts of the European Union. And to think of that region together with Russia and Lithuania as a whole, with the current borders, which are basically the former borders of the Eastern Socialist Bloc, that did not exist in the 19th century. There's nothing new under the sun, but this started with the Cold War. The idea of thinking of those who lived under communism as different. But more, it intensified after 1989, which is when communism fell, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it was a kind of an effort that we can discuss the reasons for, to keep Eastern Europe different, not to actually admit them into the Western club, even though officially that was the rhetoric, that they are now joining Western democracies. There really was no interest in truly admitting them, or for that matter, in truly admitting Russia into the Western club of white privilege, I would call it.
Yeah, and speaking of other reasons. Yeah, speaking of reasons, one of the main points that you bring up with your book is that this is kind of a byproduct of capitalism. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, so to make it as simple and hopefully clear as I can, capitalism is a system that might be regarded as those who have capital, the capitalists, extracting the fruits of labor of those who work. Okay, but that's an oversimplification, because actually capitalists fight among each other about who would accumulate the capital.
Yeah.
So it's an effort to accumulate capital, and on one hand you have those who accumulate it, and on the other hand you have those whose resources the capital is extracted from. And by resources, I mean their labor and also their mineral wealth and so whatever may be there. And so because capitalism is a competition, is competitive, those who acquire capital are not interested in sharing it now with new people, who might be part of this capitalist club.
Yeah.
Instead, they're interested in turning them into providers of labor and natural resources. And that relationship between capital accumulation and extraction of labor and resources is typical of colonialism. So the West has had long experience with it. And in 1989, this model, with very important modifications, was applied to the relationship between the long-time capitalist West and the newly capitalist regions, peripheral regions of Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. And since you brought up colonism, I want to ask, so since the region embraced the Western system like voluntarily, does that complicate or reinforce the colonial analogy?
Well, I don't really believe that whether they accepted it voluntarily or not is related to the analysis that I made. Because it's not really a question of will or not. You can end up with that system of accumulation and extraction with the consent of the people, or you could force it on them through military conquest and so forth. And in this case, it was voluntary. And I would say that it was, however, not clear to people in Eastern Europe that they would not be accepted as eventually also accumulating capital. So they were perhaps misled. But to be honest, if they had not been misled, they might still have preferred that to their membership in the Soviet-run communist system.
Mm-hmm. And so about EU, do you think that the EU enlargement truly integrate Eastern Europe, or did it create a new form of dependency?
Well, the EU enlargement did not truly incorporate Eastern Europe. I mean, that's really one of the main theses of my book. And it may not be the EU enlargement that created the dependency. I think it's more the interests of the Western and some Asian multinational corporations who were interested in new sources of profit and new markets. The European Union, I would say its influence may have been ambiguous in this case because it does provide a large measure of free market exchange. So it doesn't formalize barriers, it takes them away. But of course, in Europe itself, the Western companies, many of them multinational, are so strong compared to what the East was, which totally lacked capital, that in some way, the lack of barriers even intensified the ability of, let's say, German or French, or in some cases Italian, and so forth, companies to dominate the economy of the East.
Yeah. And so thinking about illiberalism in Central and East Europe, what elements of it do you think it's unique to Central Europe and East Europe, and what parts of it is just following a global trend like Brexit or Trumpism?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure that many parts of it are unique, but perhaps it's only that it's one, not the only regions of the world in which the tendency towards illiberalism may be slightly stronger. But that doesn't make Eastern Europe different, because I do believe it's the same illiberalism that supported Brexit and Trump. Now, let me explain. So if you look at, let's say, the map of Europe, if you look at things geographically, there's a core where capital is mostly accumulated. If you think in terms of countries, it might be the United Kingdom, Netherlands, the north, west of Europe, and Germany, and and maybe arguably Italy. And then it's the United States across the sea and Canada. Okay, so compared to that, they're the core, and the East is periphery. Okay, Slovakia is periphery. And my theory is that in the periphery, people are more liable to support illiberal movements as a revolt, a misguided revolt against this extraction of labor and resources that I was referring. But if we don't look at countries, but we look within countries, then we see very much the same relationship within the country. Okay, so you have London, which is the core of capital extraction, and then you have like the northern counties of England or some more rural areas in the country. And if you look at who supported Brexit more, it was not London. Okay, it was these more peripheral areas. If you look at Germany, the east of Germany, just in the most recent elections, again proved that it disproportionately represents right-wing parties, the AfD, as it's called there. If you look at Italy, it's a little more complicated, but the rural areas still clearly support more the currently governing Brothers of Italy party than the people who are in the major cities. So everywhere we see a relationship between peripheralization on one hand and illiberalism on the other hand. And if it looks like, I think it looks less and less so, but if it still looks like to anyone that Eastern Europe is in some special way predisposed to illiberalism, then the reason for it is that within Europe and within the Western world, Eastern Europe plays the same role as a rural area of England plays within England, or a rural area of France or Italy or Germany plays within those countries. And the periphery is not only rural, but I'm simplifying things a little bit.
Yeah, that makes actually perfect sense. Interesting, because we also have this like progression that where like the farther east you go, it's like it's thought to be more backward and like I think in one of your talks you say it's a racism against racists. Yeah.
Yeah, because this is the perversity of people like me, kind of urban liberal or progressive type of people. I'm speaking half sarcastically and half seriously. We may be so proud of how progressive we are and how not racist we are, for example, that we project it onto other people who are not quite like us, okay? So, and that's what I think happens with Eastern Europeans, that they're racist, and anti-Semitic especially. But people projecting from, something that is also in the West, and in my book I show that really there is not a very obvious difference. And when we look at America, it just occurred to me recently, and I talked about this in one of my classes. In America, there's the redneck, or the so-called white trash, okay? And it's exactly the same situation. Okay, it's blaming these people who are disproportionately Trump supporters, without a doubt, projecting onto them a kind of inherent racism and inherent inclination to be right-wing nationalists, which absolves us of thinking that we may have that in us too, but perhaps more importantly, and which I haven't mentioned, that perhaps our actions have actually, at least partly, provoked the disproportionate appeal of illiberalism in these peripheral regions, whether they be in Europe or in America.
Yeah, and in your assessment of the rise of right-wing populism, like, does the same things that we talked about here also apply to Global South?
There, I have to speculate, Mike, because I'm really not an expert on it. But one of the most interesting things in this respect is exactly what the answer may be to your question. So, if by Global South we mean the former colonies, then what we see is that this pattern of kind of internal subversion of democracy that we call illiberalism is very strong in the Philippines. It's very strong in India. And now it's becoming obvious that it's very strong in Indonesia. And this is very interesting because for so many reasons, and you might ask me other questions about it, but it's very much the same idea with the differences that perhaps in some countries like India, on my reading, the middle classes are even more engaged in supporting illiberalism than in Western countries, than in Europe. But it's very much the same global trend.
I'm thinking like, okay, so my follow-up question would be, and this might be like kind of, I don't know, but how long do you think this trend will last?
Now, that's a really good question, and if you have an answer to it, I'd love to hear it. I'm afraid it's going to last a long time, and I hope not that I'm wrong, but I don't think so. What I think is happening is that the left doesn't have answers that excite people, or if they excite them, they've been exciting them for a long time, but no new ideas that excite people. And I think about this often. So think about Bernie Sanders, who is a really charismatic personality. He says things very simply, and it's very exciting. And his ideas are, in my opinion, I agree with 99.9% of them. But none of them are new ideas. And he makes no effort to address the misguided, perhaps, concerns of those who are on the far right. And I think until we find some answers, and not just answers, but some actions, or I don't really know how this is going to go. If I don't know how much time we have, but
Sure, go ahead, yeah.
But if I can connect this to what you asked me about India and, about the Global South. So at the inception, and still to a very large extent, these illiberal movements that we're talking about in Central Europe, but also in the whole world, were very, when I say white but not quite, these are people that we could call peripheral whites. Okay, these are white people.
Yeah.
Okay, but Indians and Filipinos and Indonesians are not white people. Okay, and when we look at what's happened in the American election, I think it could seriously be argued that Donald Trump would never have been elected if he did not find growing support among every racial group except African Americans. Okay, the Hispanic vote has helped him tremendously, for example, and the Asian vote has helped him tremendously. And I think that sadly, the future of this illiberal movement is probably to still keep the votes of all the white racists, but keep it subtle enough so that the main message is not going to be about race. It's going to be more in what an outsider might see a class analysis. And so then that can include people who are not white, because otherwise electorally there's no chance that these movements can win in a country like the United States or Canada.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're saying like That's kind of like what happened in the US, and the way that he managed to tap into like every racial group is kind of a representation of a global trend.
Yeah, because he emphasizes sort of the grievances of peripheralized people. That's my theory. Now, I mentioned peripheralized by residents, but also people peripheralized by social class. So skilled working class people and lower middle class people, small business people, feel very frustrated. They don't feel that their concerns are being addressed by government, or actually also not by academia or mainstream media. So that's another story. They stopped listening to us. But a lot of these people are not white people. I mean, they're people of all backgrounds.
What are the biggest blind spots in Western political science when studying illiberalism?
So I think that that the class analysis needs to be more sophisticated. There's a lot of reluctance by people, academics, not just political scientists, to recognize that, for example, working class people are disproportionately in favor of illiberalism. And the criticism essentially would be that not all of them, which is true, not most of them, which is usually true, and not only them, which is always true. Okay, but having said those true things, it's still true that demonstrably the so-called white male without a college education has disproportionately in America supported Trump, and people who are less educated everywhere, almost without exception, support these right-wing nationalist illiberal movements. Okay, so that's something that is well known, but the not only them part includes the fact that then there are parts of high-level capital that also support these movements. Okay, so I like to speak about what I call an alliance of the very rich and the not so poor. So the billionaires and the skilled workers and small business people, for example. I think that political and other social scientists should try more to answer the basic puzzle, which is how is it that the not so poor but not by far privileged people ally themselves with the very rich? Okay, what is this class alliance? Who's a member of it? It's not all working class people, and it's not all capital. So which parts of these classes unite to support illiberalism? And once we understand that, then we'll understand why this class alliance is so attractive to voters. So these illiberal movements don't need to poison and kill people. Yeah, I'm not including Russia here. I'm not including China. They don't need to do that. They are popular enough to win fair and square, although maybe through manipulating public opinion and maybe a little more manipulation of different kinds, they're able to win elections.
I like that you brought up the idea of these voters aligning themselves with rich people, and because I was gonna ask about Elon Musk endorsement of AfD in Germany. Do you think is it more symbolic, or is it more symbolic than substantial? Like, do you think he really had an effect, or was like people were already voting for AfD and like?
I think he had no effect, because those who were already going to vote AfD, they may have been excited by Musk's support, And those who weren't going to vote that way would have been repelled by Musk's support for the AfD.
Mm. So going back to the comparison between the US and Europe. So in the West, we have culture wars, and they tend to revolve around like identity, like race, gender, sexuality. But in Central and East Europe, it's more about sovereignty and national pride. So do you think they are like fundamentally different issues or just different packaging of the same message?
Well, I disagree with you, Mike, on the assertion.
Sure.
Okay, so first of all, I like to not speak Central and Eastern Europe because then we have, again, Russia and Belarus back in the package. And I really do believe that to understand Poland, it's much more useful to understand Germany than to understand Russia. And the culture wars are very intensive in East Central Europe, as much as anywhere else. And in fact, so I was shocked to see that Canadian researchers who receive American funding have been asked if to answer the question, 4 questions, including whether they support gender ideology. Now, this term gender ideology, as far as I know, which the listeners will know, refers to supporting transgender attitudes and LGBTQ and so forth. To call it gender ideology is a language that I think, if I'm not mistaken, started in Portugal, but was certainly huge in Poland when the illiberal government was in place, because Poland reversed the illiberal government, and now they have a liberal government. But when the illiberals, inspired by Kaczynski, were in power, gender ideology was on their lips all the time. A very much a cultural thing. And there was a time when some people remember not long ago that under that government in Poland, they declared LGBTQ free zones. And so whereas when it comes to national identity, make America great again, and America this and America that, is really, I would say, if I had to make a comparison, I would say it's stronger in America than it is certainly in Czech Republic, and maybe not stronger than in Hungary. It depends, but I don't see this kind of a divide.
Yeah. Now we have Canada First.
Canada First, which I think is a slogan I don't like. And it's not because I'm unpatriotic, but Canada First copies America First. In Hungary, Orban has long had the slogan, Hungary First. I say people first, humanity together. And we don't want to answer this kind of exclusivist nationalism by substituting ourselves. And we be exclusive nationalists.
Yeah. I think the elephant in the room is Ukraine's war. And when we talk about what is happening in that part of the world, and so how do you think the war is reshaping basically everything that we've talked about so far?
Yeah. So Ukrainian leaders often speak of themselves as being in the center of Europe, the middle of Europe. I could show you all kinds of quotes by Zelensky, by generals, by many people. And so they strive to have the status of being in Central Europe, like Poland or Lithuania. So in other words, being part of the European Union, being part of NATO, and so forth. And that really is exactly what Russia is very much opposed to. So there is a relationship to what we're talking about there. More importantly, perhaps, the issue is starting to surface a little bit about what kind of a relationship would a Ukraine have with the West. Okay, if it were admitted into these organizations that I mentioned. And we can already see the development of that exploitative capital accumulation development that I spoke about within Europe after 1989. In Trump's efforts to acquire some of the mineral wealth of Ukraine, to run electrical plants in Ukraine. So he's already proposing that sort of an agenda. And if that goes on, Mike, in my opinion, the reaction from Ukraine is going to be the same. They're going to go illiberal. Okay. That's a reaction from the periphery that feels exploited by the core. And when Ukraine, if ever it's free, let's hope it is, goes illiberal, it's going to be one of the most populated countries in the EU. It's going to be a very influential country. It's going to increase the weight of illiberalism in places like Hungary or formerly in Poland. And then everybody's going to blame them on being Eastern European. They're going to say, you see, these Eastern Europeans are against liberal democracy, and how disappointed we are in them. And now how disappointed we are in Ukraine because it's going that way. That's what I'm afraid of.
So you're not really optimistic about this Ukrainian, this war helping Europe to develop a new identity beyond the East-West binary?
Yeah, I think it will help that. Yeah, no, that I think it will help. Because, especially because of the role of Poland, which is a large country, it spends a large portion of its wealth on supporting Ukraine. And it's very active in defending Ukraine. So that's raises the profile of Poland as the major East Central European country. And I think that will help European unity.
How does the recent EU's push for defense autonomy intersect with the internal illiberalism?
Well, that is also a very good question. Okay, so we haven't broached the question of why illiberals support Russia so much. It doesn't seem really to be totally logical, but in part it may be just as a reaction, again, by the periphery against the core of, for example, the European Union. Just to kind of make them mad, maybe. So, but there's also active support from Russia for illiberal movements and against rearming Europe. And it's not a theory; like we know it as a fact. You know, there are contacts between right-wing illiberal movements and Russia. So these, wherever illiberals come to dominate the country, they're not going to support arming to protect Ukraine. The exception so far is Italy, because in Italy, the Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who comes from a right-wing party with fascist roots, actually supports Ukraine. And I think she made a very wise political choice because she doesn't want Italy to be an outcast. And so far, that's the way that has been happening.
And if you want to end on a positive note, where do you see hope or potential for reform in the region?
Well, I think my positive ending would be that it doesn't necessarily need to be reformed. You know, it is not a hopelessly illiberal right-wing nationalist region. And in one of the chapters in my book, I show all kinds of statistics about to dispel this myth that even that East Central Europe is that poor, that it's dominated by gangsters and oligarchs, that trafficking women is rampant in the area. These are not ideas that are true about the countries I'm talking about. Whether they're true or not about some other countries in Eastern Europe, I don't know, but it's enough to argue that you can't look at this area as one. So if I were to reform any of the area, if I, had this dictatorial powers, I would apply them in those areas where the democracy is threatened by illiberal movements. At the moment, that's only Hungary and Slovakia. It's not the case in other places. And I would not reform them on the basis of their own particularities, but I would try to apply the same kind of understanding we apply to peripheral regions elsewhere. And we need to minimize, A, the exploitation of peripheral regions by the core, and B, the misunderstanding that people in the core, including those of us who are in academia, tend to have about the people of these peripheral regions.
Great. Thank you so much. Last question. Life advice for young people.
Well, life advice for young people: hang in there. Okay. Follow your education. Education has been shown to change people. So to relate it to our topic, the major factor really is education, and educated people support liberal democracy, to make it very simple, and not educated people may not so much. Okay? But don't go too far, because what we've been encouraging people is to think critically. So be a critical thinker, but don't become a cynic. It's okay to criticize democracy. It's okay to criticize a liberal democracy, I would say, and it's okay to criticize capitalism, and these things have many terrible aspects to them. But if we go so far as to completely reject them, we're actually giving terminology to be misused by the illiberal right. It happens all the time. The illiberal right now uses terms that we used to use. Colonialism, alternatives, neoliberalism, these have all become regularly used by right-wing demagogues, and they turn it back on us. So my advice to young people at the intellectual level is be critical, but also understand what needs to be preserved. At the personal level, I wish I had good advice for people, because this illiberal movement is actually a protest, and like I said, some of them really articulated that way, against the neoliberal system that we live in, which makes jobs both somewhat rare and precarious. And I don't envy young people who have to live in that kind of an environment. I would, like I said, just say hang in there, and let's all hope we do the right things to make it better.